today. But I think that's true. I really enjoy having some of these classes that are not necessarily always based on.
Hi, Tanny. How are you? Thank you. How have you been? Good. Yeah. Trying to get used to it, but yeah.
But a little bit more on.
Well, I'm only back part-time.
I'm just gonna mute everybody real fast. But please, you know the rules. Unmute yourself if you'd like to. I'll just keep everybody on mute now to sort of help, keep any background noise out of the way. The dog bark or the baby's cry or the significant other wants to know what we're having for dinner. So if you have anything that you wanted to talk about, I think you guys know, please just unmute yourself. Feel free to ask questions. My favorite feature is the chat box on these classes. I think it really gives you the opportunity to talk to each other. I really encourage, if you've opened a Chenin Blanc tonight or any wine, I really encourage you to share what you're tasting in the chat box. And you may even, since we all know that we have, probably have Chenin Blanc, right? So maybe a fun game would be to describe your wine and have people guess in the chat where it might be coming from. It could be fun, right? So as I was saying, we'll be exploring the world of Chenin Blanc today, what this grape variety means, where it's planted. It is what we would consider to be an international grape variety. It is incredibly versatile in the world of wine in terms of what it makes. I oftentimes like to think of it as sort of France's answer to Riesling, where of course we do have Riesling within Alsace in France, but it really is a wine that can be made in a huge range of styles, from very dry to very sweet. It can make the best botrytis wines. It has a long capability for aging because of its acidity. It doesn't quite have the fruit notes of Riesling most of the time. Sometimes we like to compare it a little bit more to Chardonnay and the fact that it's a slightly more neutral grape variety. But I think that really allows this unique grape to showcase the features of the place and also the conditions of the harvest in which these particular wines are made. So some pretty cool stuff to talk about today. Did I cover everything? Everybody's doing well? Check in with the chat real fast. Fantastic. I see some Vouvray. I see some blends. Perfect. I see some wine from South Africa. I'm also drinking a wine from South Africa, which is also a blend. So we'll chit chat about that a little bit more. Okay, welcome. Let's get going. Let's move on to our little Chenin adventure here, right? Sometimes I just have to find a way to entertain myself as I'm setting up for you guys. All right, let's see. There we go. Okay, so we already know we're doing a Chenin Blanc around the world class, right? Nobody's here for like a Cabernet Sauvignon class. If you were, I would say you're gonna learn a lot then if that was the case. All right, so we're talking about Chenin Blanc around the world this evening. So what is Chenin Blanc, of course? We know a little bit less about this grape variety than we know about many others, although it is an international grape variety, although we do know about how incredibly, as I mentioned, versatile it really can be, both in the glass and both in the terroir that it's grown in. We don't know as much about it as, say, something like Chardonnay or something like Sauvignon Blanc, which are also both French grapes that have really been planted in almost any region in the world today that makes wine. It's hard to find a region that doesn't have, for white grapes, I would say Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc in some capacity. But Chenin has really only been adopted to a few areas where it's really considered to do the best. So I think this is kind of exciting that we really get to look at the world through the lens of a grape that sort of become very set on its own terroir in a way. Like, I think Chenin as a grape really has a pretty big personality. It has a lot to say. We don't know, as we know with many grapes, the entire parentage of Chenin Blanc. We do know that it's the offspring of Sauvignon, so a grape variety that's native to northern France, we find Sauvignon oftentimes in places like the Jura. We also see it in Alsace. It's also considered to possibly be an offspring of Sauvignon Blanc, although this has been disputed. Most likely actually a sibling of Chenin Blanc rather than a parent. So we do know that its place of origin is Anjou within the Loire Valley. Like many grape varieties, when we begin to study and understand their parentage and their heritage, we really look at the type of clones and the modifications that have taken place in particular wine regions to establish how long a particular grape variety has been there. So typically, if you have a region that has a higher number of clones of the same grape as another region, especially in the old world, before we really started understanding how to clone grape varieties themselves, right? We understand that probably that variety had been in that region long enough to mutate that many times. So we kind of look at it like that. We do think that historical record indicated Chenin's presence in 845, although we don't have complete proof of this, but they did discuss wines at the Abbey de Glanfuel that we believe were referring to the Chenin Blanc grape. The earliest appearance of the actual term Chenin Blanc, which is named for Mount Chenin in Touraine, in print was in 1534. So I think this is really interesting. And if we talk just a little bit about the history of Chenin Blanc, and we'll spend quite a bit of time in the Loire Valley because it is one of the most important areas for the production of Chenin Blanc in the world. So certainly we'll talk a lot about that. But post 1534, we really know that the Dutch had a really big influence on spreading Chenin Blanc throughout the Loire Valley. So the Dutch, we talk about this quite a bit, were great lovers of wine. They could not necessarily grow a lot of grapes successfully within the Netherlands, and they became master distillers. Now, the Loire Valley was very accessible to especially places on the coast like Rotterdam, and it was really easy to use a lot of this grape material that was located within the Loire Valley for a lot of the distillation and the distillate that they actually use within the Netherlands as well. So this is also really important, but it wasn't only the grapes they were using for distillate. They were also drinking a lot of these sort of noble sweet wines that were coming out of the region of Anjou at the time. So as far as viticultural characteristics, it is a thin-skinned grape. It buds early and it ripens late. We're primarily talking about cool climates here. We'll talk about warm climate, Chenin Blanc in a bit. That seems like kind of an oxymoron to say something like a warm climate white wine, you know, grape or white grape variety, but we'll discuss that in a few moments. So we're primarily talking about cool climate, and usually when we talk about quality Chenin Blanc, it's a cool climate within that country. So obviously you always think about, when you're talking about wine, a cool and a warm climate, not in the context of all cool climates within the world, but in the context of the climate of that particular country. So a cool climate in France would be much cooler than a cool climate in somewhere like South Africa, or even maybe somewhere like California as well. So thin skin, early budding, late ripening. I always say these are all great descriptors to talk about grapes, but if we don't really understand the characteristics or what that might give us in a grape variety or a wine, then what good does it do us, right? So thin skin, as we're talking about the grape itself, we're saying that the skin of the grape that you would actually peel back to expose the flesh underneath is very thin. Now in red winemaking, this oftentimes has a correlation with both the color of the wine and also the texture and the intensity of the tannin on the palate. Well, most white wines are made without skin contact, so we usually don't talk about that texture and that tannin from the skins of the grape. Sometimes we will get some color depending on that, but what it does mean in white wines is that sometimes thin-skinned grape can be more susceptible to certain what we would call viticultural hazards, right? Hazards that might take place within the vineyard. Now, the next thing we're saying is that it's early budding and late ripening. So early budding and late ripening is actually a pretty good thing for a grape variety, because that's telling us that this grape variety has one of the longest times on the vine to accumulate aroma, flavor, phenols, anthocyanins, any of those sort of compounds that we might use to add complexity or structure or more sugar, more ripeness to a wine itself. So early budding, late ripening, these are usually pretty good things, but what it also means is that the grape is more susceptible to the vagaries of weather during these seasons as well. So if we bud early, we're more susceptible to spring frost. This could damage our yields, make them lower. This is a hazard for the livelihood of the winemakers themselves. And when we talk about late ripening, we're also talking about a lot of things that change in weather, especially in cool climates, in the old world, particularly in northern France here, that can happen while we're waiting for the harvest. So, you know, in the spring, we're usually talking about frost. In the fall, waiting for the harvest, we're usually talking about storm, rain, snow, all sorts of things to do with weather, as well as thinking about, you know, grapes accumulate sugar. They're quite attractive to animals who are looking to hibernate for the winter as well, or maybe migrating to warmer places for the winter. In South Africa, one of the biggest issues, pest issues, aside from birds, is actually baboons, who really enjoy the flavor of these incredibly rich, ripe, sugar-filled grapes before they're harvested, right? So now we understand early budding, late ripening. It is susceptible to what we call botrytis or gray rot. These are the same type of mold, essentially, but botrytis is when we're talking about the benevolent form of this mold. This is the type of mold that we actually like on our grapes, known for producing the best sweet wines of the world. But gray rot is the kind of malevolent form of this. So they're actually the same, but we want to take precautions, and we plant grape varieties, especially that are thin-skinned, in regions that we know will be more appropriate for creating botrytis as opposed to gray rot. In a bad year, you may not be able to get rid of gray rot at all. So also, again, going to lower your yields, give you less grapes. It can also affect the flavors of the wine itself, gray rot, but this would usually be in the case that maybe the grape grower or the winemaker is not as careful about getting all of that gray rot out of the grapes themselves. So a great winemaker will always make a great wine, even if gray rot affects the vineyard, because they'll cut out any of that rot and they'll only take the healthy grapes. But of course, again, this does affect their livelihood for that particular year. It is susceptible to odium, but it does have a resistance to downy mildew, two American grapevine diseases that are both in South Africa and France, the two main areas we'll talk about. It prefers calcareous soils. We'll talk about tuffo. We'll talk about chalk. It also doesn't mind being on a little bit of clay. And then it's common blending partners. So oftentimes we see this as a varietal wine, especially, of course, when we describe it as Chenin Blanc. When we think about it coming from the Loire, we're usually talking about Vouvray, maybe Chenin Blanc. We're often talking about sparkling wines that might be blended, but are usually based on Chenin Blanc themselves. But it can be blended with a few other grape varieties within Loire. We'll talk about Chardonnay, Colombard, and Sauvignon Blanc. So also with Semillons, like the one that I'm drinking here, coming from South Africa. So the Naude, which is a blend of Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and Chenin Blanc. So what's really interesting about this wine, and maybe we'll talk about it in a few moments. So this is a 2009. It is a wine of origin Western Cape. So coming from anywhere within the Western Cape within South Africa. Unlike almost any other country, if your wine comes from a region outside of the stated region, you have to have 100%. Sorry, I said that kind of weird. You have to have 100% of the region itself the grapes have to come from. That's very different than somewhere like California, where it's usually 85%, and so forth. So this is a blend of these three grape varieties. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But usually you see Chardonnay, Colombard within California for your kind of basic and bulk wine. If it's blended within Loire, it's usually not as much of a bulk wine. It could just be more akin to sort of the field blend or maybe bulking up the production a little bit. But usually within the New World, we'll talk about when we get to California, if you're making a bulk wine, you're actually using Chenin Blanc to add acidity to the wine. So we'll talk about this when we get to the flavors in just a second. So your major countries of production, who would have said that the most Chenin Blanc in the world is planted in France? Now, I know a lot of us study wine, so probably you're all a little too smart for that. You're like, oh, come on, Amber. We know that it's planted in South Africa. So almost double the amount of Chenin Blanc is planted in South Africa as it is in France. However, when it comes to kind of the idea of the old world and the new world with Chenin Blanc, I think we oftentimes think of the new world as sort of, again, your kind of bulk production, sort of, you know, blended expressions. And we think it's kind of these two different sides, like two sides of the coin, yin and yang, right? You have the kind of biddable bulk wine, high production new world, and then you have your sort of revered and collectible old world wines. But most of the wine is coming from actually from the new world. Actually within South Africa, they have more old vine production of Chenin Blanc in the ground itself than we have of Chenin Blanc in all of France as well. So I think this is really interesting. We'll talk about that. You can see here that also the wines come in pretty different colors here. So we do have this is Rat Chenin Blanc coming from South Africa. I don't know when, I mean, I'm assuming that this said 2007. I'm assuming this wasn't a picture taken this year. I found it online. But you can certainly see the difference in the color of these wines here. So one may have been aged in stainless steel. Another may have been exposed to oxygen via old oak barrels. One may be a little bit older as well, which also intensifies and deepens and darkens the color of the wine. But you can certainly see that it's not really one size fits all in terms of color. The third country is California, continuously decreasing in acreage, but we've seen a little bit of a revival in terms of California Chenin Blanc. And then also in Argentina and a little bit in Australia and New Zealand, but a very, very small amount. In South Africa, Chenin Blanc itself is known as Steen, the most common term that we see used for that, although a lot of producers are trying to kind of globalize their product and using Chenin Blanc more often. Steen is sort of an older term that we use for the wine. In France, you'll also see it called Pinot d'Anjou, Pinot de la Loire, and just Pinot. In South America, Pinot Bianco, which I think is really interesting. I'm wondering how long they'll be able to get away with that with importing, but oftentimes in South America, the wines are also used for sort of more kind of everyday bulk blend as well. You see a lot of major styles. So Chenin Blanc, much like Riesling, because of its incredible acidity, its ability to age, it's really made in a huge range of styles. So you have sparkling wines, especially within the Loire. They can be pétillant, just very slightly sparkling, about 1.5 atmospheres. You might see Mousseux, which has a little bit more sparkle to it. And then you'll see Cremant as well, which is, of course, most of us know is made in the Champagne style that you'll find coming from regions in France that aren't in Champagne itself. You'll also see dry sec or sec tendre on the label quite often for your dry style of Chenin Blanc coming from Loire Valley. Demi-sec, sort of your half dry, partially dry. Molu being sweet, and doux, which is your very sweet style of wine. Molu and doux are terms you see used by classic producers. I think Domaine Huet is a producer many people are familiar with, coming from Vouvray. And they'll also often use these sort of classic terms on their wine to let the consumer know what they should be expecting. Now, I have had some Domaine Huet coming from the late 80s, 1989, labeled as Merlot, and it was actually quite dry. So sugar is something that usually changes in the bottle over time and becomes less sweet. So this was a style of wine where the acidity was still incredibly present, and the sugar itself in the bottle had tempered a bit, at least on the palate, or the acidity was so high that the actual residual sugar in the wine itself was not as noticeable because of the acidity. Kind of cool stuff, right? How like your palate doesn't know sometimes when something is sweet because it's balanced. And I think, you know, we oftentimes talk about Riesling, and when we're talking about Chenin Blanc coming from France, I would kind of say the same thing we say about Riesling itself, is oftentimes we don't make it to be sweet, but we do leave some natural sugar in the wine to be balanced. So we'll discuss that a little bit. And you can really see now, if we were looking at, you know, where is Chardonnay or where is Sauvignon Blanc planted in the world, really almost every country would be filled in. Within Europe here, certainly Australia, of course, New Zealand would both be filled in. Chile, Argentina itself, we have a little bit here in California, but the two main countries of production are really South Africa and France. So I think this is pretty fascinating itself. Over half produced within South Africa, followed by France, very small percentage in the United States, and less importantly, Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand. Not saying that there are not some great examples coming out of those countries, because certainly there are, but in the whole scheme of things, I certainly don't see them quite as much. All right. Jeff, what is a sweet styler? Which sweet styler name is for? Oh, for botrytis. For botrytis wine. We'll talk about that in a moment, Jeff, because I think that more often with those terms we usually are thinking about Vouvray, and so we'll talk more about the botrytis style wine, which usually you'll know those because of the name of the appellation itself on the bottle. So let's talk about just what I was mentioning, kind of. So Vouvray versus Sauvignon. So these are the two most important dry Chenin Blanc regions within the Loire Valley. Now, Vouvray can be made in many different styles, from dry to sweet. It can also be made as a sparkling wine, which is also quite common. Now, Sauvignon can be made in a sweet style. It is legal for the appellation. It is possible, but most producers really understand that this kind of creates the Loire's most powerful, ageable, dry style of Chenin Blanc within the Loire. So Sauvignon, think, you know, think long aging, maybe like Savage, you know, it can have a really long life in the bottle. It's dry, it can be piercing, and it's incredibly intense, especially for a white wine. So how would we sort of differentiate these two wines possibly in a blind tasting? Well, there are different areas within the Loire Valley we'll talk about in a moment. But if you were looking at the wines itself, visually, your Vouvray will typically be a pale straw. You might see a little hint of green if that wine is quite young, and a moderate concentration. Vouvray will always have sort of a pale yellow or even gold characteristic to it. Oh, sorry, did I say Vouvray? Sauvignon, excuse me, will always have a pale yellow or gold characteristic to it. Now, it's common, and this is not necessarily mandated by law, but it's more common within Vouvray to maybe see the production of Chenin Blanc in stainless steel barrels, while in Sauvignon, it's more common to usually see this done in the more traditional old tonneau or large oak barrel that are neutral. So they do allow for a slow amount of oxidation, which will intensify the color of the wine, which will give you more yellow and gold, but will not add oak flavor to the wine. In the Loire Valley, I would say it's not common to see new oak used on the wine, although I have seen it, but I would not call it typical of the Loire Valley itself. So let's talk a little bit about the fruit as well. We see a lot of tree fruit. So when we talk about Chenin Blanc, we like to say it has more of the neutral aroma of something like Chardonnay. So we talk about tree fruit, that green, that golden apple, that quince, that yellow pear. Maybe if it's a really cold vintage in Loire Valley where it's already quite cool, we might see a little bit more green pear. We talk a lot about that citrus, tangerine, bergamot, lemon. And then we start to get into a little bit more tropical fruit. If we're seeing a vintage that has a little bit more ripeness. And usually in that case, we might have a little bit of sugar left in the wine as well. So in Vouvray, maybe we see like melon and tropical fruits. And then in Sauvignon, that wine will typically be dry, so it will be quite powerful. The alcohol level is usually quite high for Sauvignon compared to something like Vouvray, where it will still be moderate in alcohol itself. But we'll get to that. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So you'll certainly see more of these stone fruit, and particularly more of that sort of like dried apricot, dried peach characteristic. We do see a little bit of a sulfuric note in Vouvray, particularly if the wine is done in screw cap, which you're seeing more commonly. But Chenin Blanc is prone to oxidation itself, much like a red grape, maybe like Grenache is, right? So you oftentimes within Chenin Blanc, you get these characteristics of this slightly bruised apple, a little slight nuttiness. Sometimes we say this sort of like cheese rind characteristic. Now, Sauvignon on the north side of the Loire River, again, tends to be more powerful. The grapes do tend to get riper, and it's fermented dry. So you see these aromas and these flavors intensified. So instead of almond, maybe some marzipan. You might have pistachio. And then you see this more of this oxidative character than you typically would within Vouvray. So a deeper color, more intense aroma and flavor on the palate. Sometimes some herbal, chamomile, tea notes. Sometimes a little bit of green characteristic, but not green like you would see in Sauvignon Blanc necessarily. But certainly we'd see some of that organic earth characteristic. Probably you might consider that to be a little bit of that slight white mushroom characteristic. Oftentimes we say that it has a little bit of straw. In Vouvray, you probably will see a higher percentage of inorganic earth minerality. So that sort of limestone, that tuffeau, chalk characteristic, more wet stone. And then that will be a little bit intensified. You'll get a lot of like sort of darker damp rock, what we call minerality, coming from Sauvignon. And then you also, another common descriptor, this sort of like wet wool or lanolin. It's almost like beeswax characteristic in Chenin Blanc as well. Now, why aren't we describing yet Chenin Blanc from the New World, right? We only have Vouvray and Sauvignon here, right? We'll talk about that in a few moments. Now, the yields are typically quite different between the Old and the New World. In Loire Valley, the yield for Chenin Blanc, especially for the areas where we do begin to see botrytis, which I don't think we discussed yet. So botrytis adds flavor to this noble rot that grows on the grapes. It concentrates both the aromas and the flavors as well as the sugar in the grape itself. And oftentimes it adds flavor too. So it adds flavors of the sort of honey characteristic, saffron, ginger, marmalade. Sometimes people say like a little bit of marshmallow too, which I always get like, it took me a long time to be able to discern botrytis and blind tasting, but like once you get it, I feel like it's something you never forget. For me, it is that like that sort of marmalade and ginger characteristic, and you smell it, you start to get it on Riesling, you start to get it on Pinot Gris coming from Alsace, you start to get it on Chenin Blanc. And when you get this botrytis character, if you're blind tasting, it really narrows the world down of where you can possibly be. So it's really interesting. On the structure itself, Vouvray will be dry to off dry. If it is a very sweet wine, you'll see like Huet, that Malo, that dew labeling on the bottle to tell you that that's a sweet wine. Sauvignon will be dry. I've never actually had one that has sugar to it. Sauvignon will be full-bodied. It is a full-bodied white wine where Vouvray is moderate in body. They both have high acidity. If you're drinking a wine that you're like, wow, this has a lot of color to it, has a lot of aroma, I have sometimes mixed up Chardonnay, like I kind of thought riper New World Chardonnay with Sauvignon because it has so much intensity to it. But start thinking about, is there oak to this wine? If there's no oak, probably not a Chardonnay. You know, usually unless we're talking about Chablis, but the aromas will be quite different in that case. And you also have high alcohol, oftentimes in Sauvignon. So this will be another giveaway. You have a lot of alcohol, you have a lot of acidity, and you have these oxidative, intense aromas and flavors. You'll have diminished to moderate alcohol, still with that high acidity within Vouvray. Cool stuff, right? So I mentioned too, we'll talk about some of the New World flavors in Chenin Blanc as we begin to get there, but we're gonna run through the Loire Valley and talk about what we have here first. But I think it's important too that we sort of understand in the New World, we oftentimes don't talk about a lot of the mineral characteristics that we are, especially with Chenin Blanc within the Loire Valley and within the Old World. So this has a lot to do probably with climate, and we talk a lot about climate. If you have a early budding, late ripening, thin-skinned grape, you could probably grow that in a lot of regions where it will do quite well, especially if they're warmer, and especially if the climate itself and the changes of weather at the change of the season are not as extreme like they are in cooler climates, right? All cooler climates have more extreme changes when it comes to the seasons. However, the wine probably will not have the characteristics of Chenin Blanc that we just described, which is something that we see within the New World quite a bit. Now, something else that we often see in difference is yield. So Chenin Blanc itself is also a naturally high yielding grape, meaning it produces a lot of fruit. It's a heavy producer. Some grapevines like to produce a lot of fruit, some don't. Chenin Blanc, especially when it is in a warm climate with a lot of water, think irrigation, grows extremely high yield. So when we begin to talk about sort of our basic tier of Chenin Blanc within Loire Valley, something like Chenin Blanc or Anjou Blanc, which are both made from 100% Chenin Blanc or primarily Chenin Blanc, the yields for that is around 45 hectoliters per hectare. Maybe that doesn't mean anything to you, but just keep that number in mind, right? Like, so you can take 45 hectoliters of juice from, so you can take 45 hectoliters of juice from 45 hectares, right? So that's how that works out. In the New World, in places like South Africa, or maybe places like the Central Valley in California, places like Riverina or Riverland in Australia, you might see yields that are 175 hectoliters per hectare. So keep this in mind when you think about when these grapes are grown with, when they don't have any issues with thinking that they need to ripen, when they don't have any issues with thinking that they're going to have any water, they produce a lot of grapes, and these grapes are very diluted in terms of their sort of original characteristics, and also the intensity of their aroma and flavor in comparison to these Chenin Blanc grapes that are coming from lower yields. That makes sense, right? So we'll just keep that in mind for a little bit as well. Within Anjou, the white wines were some of France's most highly regarded wines during the Middle Ages. The Dutch wine trade, as we mentioned earlier, really developed the trade of these sweet wines during the 16th and the 17th centuries. They were also probably instrumental in taking Chenin Blanc to South Africa as well, where it's the most planted today. So really quite important. So we know, as I mentioned, the Dutch, they loved wine, they drank a lot of it, couldn't grow a lot of it. So they really had a big influence on some of the most important wine regions in France today. So that would include, besides the Loire Valley, but also Bordeaux. So really important during this time. Leading up to phylloxera in the late 1800s, we really saw sort of the heyday of the Loire Valley wine. And there are several things that, you know, we always talk about wine regions and sort of the ebb and flow of their popularity and their productivity, right? Well, there's never one thing that contributes to what happens here. Well, one, these wines were so popular within the Netherlands that it was actually the citizens of Rotterdam who had their pick of the best vintages of these sweet wines prior to the citizens of Paris or the citizens of France. So big deal here. But as we begin to sort of go through the different, you know, what would you say, the relationships of trade between countries within Europe over these centuries, sometimes wine regions fall out of favor, right? So we certainly see that happening. And even leading up to phylloxera, the wines were not nearly as important as they may have been during even the 17th or the 18th centuries as well. Post-phylloxera, prior to this time, prior to phylloxera, most of the wines within the Anjou region, Anjou-Saumur, in the Loire Valley were white wine. Now this would differ, we won't talk about sort of Nantes right now, but in Nantes, closer to the ocean, where it's actually more common now to see white grape coming from, or white wine coming from the Malone grape. It was actually more red wine planted there prior to a grape frost that happened within that region as well. So kind of interesting how this changes here. But post-phylloxera, we see a large planting of hybrid grapes, things that are not necessarily designed for great quality, but maybe more for quantity. And it was really in the 70s and the 80s that we see a lot of the Chenin Blanc, or the white grapes, within Anjou and Saumur being replaced with red grapes. So the 70s and the 80s, we saw a big boom in things like Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon within the region. And although historically this region was planted primarily to white, out of the three colors of wine that they produce today, rosé, red, and white, rosé accounts for about half of everything that they make, followed by red, and then finally white wine. A lot of that might have to do with these sort of beautiful lower yield sweet wines that we're going to talk about in a moment here. But we can make Anjou Blanc coming from anywhere within Anjou. So we're talking about two regions, Anjou and Saumur, that are sort of oftentimes considered to be considered collectively within this area, right? Saumur we find more often to be the center of the red wine production within Anjou Saumur, but also the production, the kind of capital production of the sparkling wine coming from the Loire Valley too. So Anjou Blanc, we can sort of see this coming from anywhere within Anjou, of course. We do have fairly low yields here, typically around 45 hectoliters per hectare. The wines themselves, if you're using Anjou Blanc on the label, must adhere to a minimum of 80% Chenin Blanc. We might see 100% Chenin Blanc. It just has to be a minimum of 80%. The wines are typically dry, although Anjou Blanc can come in and off dry, or slightly demi-sec style. Demi-sec is just sort of like lightly sweet, right? And if it's only a minimum of 80% Chenin Blanc within Anjou Blanc, the remainder of that blend will be Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc. So they can intersperse those two grape varieties themselves. And then we move into sort of our sweet wine. We'll talk about Sauvignon. So Sauvignon, we already know it's dry, but let's talk a little bit about some of these sweet wine appellations within Anjou as well. So I just want to check the chat because I see we have a few. Danielle, so about the high and low yield characteristic, yes. So I think the most important thing, I'm not sure exactly what you're saying you missed, but the most important distinction comes in the concentration and the quality of the grapes. So high yield grapes will usually be more diluted. The high yield usually need a lot of water. So we're talking about irrigation. The grapes themselves, the vines, aren't as worried about making sure that those grapes are ripe enough themselves as well. So usually we talk about the concentration of these lower yields, and better concentration in your grape typically should translate into better concentration in your wine. So like we kind of talk a lot about, we can think about Pinot Grigio coming from Italy in this way, where a lot of Pinot Grigio coming from the Veneto is just like, tastes like nothing, right? I think we can all agree that sometimes when somebody asks for, if you have a friend that comes over and they want a Pinot Grigio, they're asking you for a white wine that doesn't taste like anything. Does that mean that all Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris grapes make this sort of innocuous wine? Of course they don't, because when Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris is grown in places like Alsace, or it's grown in places like Friuli, or even when it's grown in the Veneto but treated with care and not overcropped, it can really make some beautiful intense wines that have this sort of bitter almond characteristic, this beautiful kind of cantaloupe and melon fruit as well. Norm, I don't, as far as I know, they can't irrigate in the Loire. I was referring to like old world and new world when I was talking about the distinction between yields. So I'm sorry if that was confusing, but somebody might know different, but I don't believe that they can irrigate within the Loire Valley. All right, cool. So let's move on to some of these, sweet wine appellations that we're going to be talking about. So if somebody asks you, what are these sweet wine appellations of Anjou? you're going to say, oh, well, this is really easy. So Anjou, Coteau de la Loire, is 100% Chenin Blanc, makes sweet wine. And all of the following are actually 100% Chenin Blanc as well. So Anjou, Coteau de la Loire. So we're over here on the western side of Savinière. So kind of bisected by the Loire River. Savinière is completely on the north bank of the Loire itself. We'll talk about the Coteau de Lobans. This is an area I don't see oftentimes coming into the United States. I think oftentimes the wines are quite popular locally. They're not as well known, so they're not as expensive as sweet wine coming from other regions within Anjou. So they're often kind of snapped up by bistros within Paris and a lot of these local restaurants along the Loire River as well. We talk about Coteau de la Loire, Coteau du Léon, which is the larger green area that you see here. Now, the three of these all produce wine that have a minimum residual sugar level of 34 grams per liter. So what does that mean? So we're talking about a liter bottle of wine. We know most wine comes in a 750, of course, but it's just a unit of measurement. So they're saying within a liter, 34 grams of sugar. Now, most of your extremely sweet wines, like your dessert style wines, if you think of like the Muscat Baume de Vanille, right? This is a wine that oftentimes has 110 grams per liter of residual sugar in the wine or higher. So these are luscious sweet wines, right? 34 grams per liter is more of what we would consider almost like a demi-sec or an off-dry style, depending on the level of acidity to balance out that natural sugar as well. So 34 grams per liter, although it might sound high, is not that unreasonable. If you think about sometimes like an off-dry, like a lightly sweet Mosel Riesling, it will usually be around 20 grams per liter. So if you think about Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola has about 110 grams per liter of sugar too. You don't necessarily notice that Coca-Cola is so sweet because they put so much tartaric acid in it to trick you, and it works, right? So Coteau de Lobans, Coteau du Léon, and Anjou, Coteau de la Loire, all 34 grams per liter of residual sugar. So these wines can have more, but this is the minimum. So many times these wines will be just off dry. These are all wines that should be in a way affected by some botrytis or some terroirs. So this is the concept of letting the vine itself raisinate slightly, or letting the grape itself raisinate slightly on the vine. So what does this do? It also concentrates the flavors within the grape. It also concentrates the sugar, which gives us more sugar in the finished wine itself because we don't ferment all of it to total dryness. So keep that in mind as well. Anjou, Coteau de la Loire will oftentimes be affected by botrytis, but unfortunately we don't have as many vintages that are botrytis heavy in the Loire Valley anymore that we did prior. So kind of an important distinction to make. Now, wines that are affected within these regions by botrytis may be labeled as SGN, so Selection des Grands Nobles, meaning that these are botrytis affected grapes. So you may see the term Vindage Tardive, kind of means late harvest. These grapes are grapes that might have raisined on the vine or be picked later when they've accumulated more sugar. And that just usually means Vindage Tardive, late harvest. It doesn't usually mean that the grape is affected by this botrytis mold. Now, when you see SGN, Selection des Grands Nobles, they're telling you that that wine is affected by botrytis. Now, why is that? Because they're telling you that they picked each one of these berries individually. So in all of these regions, and especially Bonazou and Cour de Tram, these grapes are actually picked individually. So in Coteau de Lobans, Coteau du Léon, and Anjou, Coteau de la Loire, now these wines will be less expensive because they usually pick whole bunches. Unless we're making SGN wine, they're usually going through the vineyard and they're picking these bunches. So they're not all affected by botrytis. They might not all be affected by this raisioning of the grapes themselves. So you get sort of this sweeter juice and less sweet juice that we make a wine out of. In Bonazou, Cour de Tram, and SGN, Selection des Grands Nobles wine, they're telling you that these wines are so affected by botrytis that they're making several passes through the vineyard. So they're going through the vineyard in trees, and they're looking for the grapes that have the perfect amount of botrytis on them on each individual one. And they're only picking off of that bunch of grapes the individual grapes that have the correct amount of botrytis to them. Now they know, because botrytis doesn't affect a bunch of grapes the same way, it affects each grape on that bunch individually. So they know that maybe later that week or in 3 days or the next day that they're going to come back, they're going to walk through that vineyard again, and they're going to pick each grape that is now at that optimal level of botrytis. Now they could do this sometimes as few as 3 times, sometimes as many as 15 times. So obviously in a year where they're passing through the vineyard, 10, 15 times, this is a very labor intensive wine, so it's going to be quite expensive. Now, Bonazou and Coeur de Chaume. Coeur de Chaume is considered to be the first Grand Cru within the Loire Valley. We think that Savennières will likely follow. You can see that the minimum level of sugar ripeness, 51 grams per liter in Bonazou, which is located just down here, and 85 grams per liter of Coeur de Chaume increases. So this is telling you, by looking at the label and seeing that it says Coeur de Chaume or Bonazou, that these are going to be more in your style of luscious sweet wine. Bonazou sees a higher production. It's quite larger than Coeur de Chaume. It's also because of its location, typically produces more wine. Also because it is larger too. Coeur de Chaume, being the best, only produces wine within, of course, the best years. It's not uncommon for producers who make Coeur de Chaume or even Coteaux de Laban to also produce wine within Savennières, which we'll get to. Now, what about Saumur and Saumur Blanc and Saumur Mousseux? So we're talking about sparkling wine here, a minimum of 60% Chenin Blanc within the area. Saumur Blanc since 2016 must be 100% Chenin Blanc. So a higher percentage, minimum percentage than we see in Anjou Blanc. But a lot of the wine made within Saumur is sparkling. So they can make up actually the rest of that blend. It could be Sauvignon Blanc, it could be Chardonnay, and they can also use red grapes within Saumur Mousseux as well. So you could have some Cabernet Franc, some Grollo, some Gamay, and even some Cabernet Sauvignon, making up the rest of your Saumur sparkling wine as well. Within Coteaux du Léon, there is a string of vineyards along the Loire River and villages that may append their name to Coteaux du Léon. So you may see a village name appended to it that requires lower yield, and usually will tell you that these grapes are a little bit riper. All of these vineyards are facing south, so they tend to get a little bit more intensity from the sun as well. We're also in an area here where as we move a little bit further east, we're kind of shifting from that maritime into this more continental climate. So many of these south-facing vineyards also are able to catch some of those breezes that are actually coming in from the Atlantic, which enables these wines to be affected by botrytis, where the mold forms within the morning, but in the afternoon, the winds come in and dry the grapes out. So this helps the botrytis from turning to that malevolent form of gray rot. Kind of fun stuff, right, guys? All right, cool. We're moving on. I'm sorry, I was like so obsessed with everything we're talking about Chenin Blanc. So moving into Savennières, now we're on the north side of the Loire River. You can see over here we have Coeur de Chaume, Coteaux de Laban, primarily schist and sandstone, south-facing. The wines of Savennières, we've already talked quite a bit about them. Dry, usually 4 to 7 grams per liter of residual sugar. They're known for their nerve, their concentration, their longevity. Oftentimes we like to say that most Savennières, especially the traditional producers and styles, need at least 7 years in the bottle before they're drinkable. This is actually to help the acidity in the wine tame down, because they can be very austere to begin with because of their power, because of their acidity, and because of the alcohol. It's considered to probably become the Loire Valley's second Grand Cru after Coeur de Chaume across the river here. We have 2 appellations located within Savennières, Coulée des Sorentes, which is a 7-hectare monopole of the Joly family, Nicolas Joly. But the vineyard itself has actually been farmed since the 11th century when it was planted. There's been a from my understanding, there's actually been a harvest of every single vintage since the 11th century within this area, the Coulée des Savants. Nicolas Joly is a biodynamic producer. I understand he doesn't even allow cell phones in his vineyards and in his cellar, so if you go to visit, beware. But he really views himself as a caretaker of the land. I saw an interview with him. He says, Coulée des Savants is not his, it doesn't belong to his family. They're just the caretakers for now. They also have a stake in La Roche-Amoyne, which is a 33-hectare appellation, also located within Savonier, and also Clos de la Bergerie and Clos du Papillon, which are two other sites. These are well-known sort of lieux-dits or vineyard sites, but that are not necessarily their own appellation within Savonier as well, located a little bit further to the southwest over here. So moving a little bit further east into Touraine. So luckily we've kind of talked about a lot of these regions when we were comparing them together before. Now we're on the north side of the Loire River, but we're in Touraine. So a different area of the Loire Valley than Anjou, which we see over here where we were just discussing Anjou and Samoa. Now we're over here in Touraine. So Touraine is primarily, I would say, known for its red wine, coming primarily from Cabernet Franc, places like Chinon, Bourgogne, St. Nicolas de Bourgogne, Touraine Red, which is typically based on Cabernet Franc as well. An area that's been sort of heavily farmed for grapes since the Middle Ages. It owes a lot to monks and monasteries who refined the local viticulture. We do have a soil, sort of a bedrock known as tuffeau within the area, which is a calcareous sort of chalk limestone. So most of the houses and the cellars themselves, the wineries, are actually built into this tuffeau. And then the vines are planted on the tuffeau above, but it has sort of more of a clay and gravel topsoil on the plateau above this area. We're beginning to see more and more dry styles of Vouvray. This is an area in Vouvray we produce every style of Chenin Blanc. So we could have sparkling, dry, or sec, demi-sec, Malou, or doux style wine. So you're more commonly going to see those terms on a bottle of Vouvray as well, to help the consumer sort of distinguish between those particular styles. It's one of the last harvests to take place, often in November within France. So you can imagine these vignerons just kind of like biting their nails, hoping that the harvest or the weather won't turn too quickly. And of course, in less ripe vintages, we do see more dry styles. So we don't usually have enough wine or enough sugar to really leave within the grapes itself. So we usually see these more sort of light and bright styled within Vouvray. They don't have the power of Savonier, even when they're dry. They're definitely more mineral driven. They'll be balanced a little bit more on that sort of like green apple and citrus fruit characteristic. And oftentimes a lot of the grapes in cooler vintages will go into sparkling wine because we really like to maintain that acidity. One thing we didn't talk about yet is malolactic fermentation within the Loire Valley. I would say usually it's avoided or done partially. There are producers who do different things, but a lot of what we really love about Chenin Blanc coming from Loire is that sort of that really beautiful, like bright acidity. So malolactic fermentation is something that a producer might utilize to make the wine approachable younger. If we're in Savonier, maybe we have a more modern producer who wants to use that to make his wine drinkable in less than 7 years. But the more traditional producers eschew malolactic fermentation. They don't use that to make the wine creamier and softer. Across the river in Mont-Louis-sur-Loire, just across the river from Vouvray, right over here on the south bank, is one of my favorite regions, known as Mont-Louis-sur-Loire. This is overshadowed by Vouvray, but it is quite larger. They do have lighter, sandier soil. The wines are less sharply defined by their acidity, and they do have less ageability. But many of the wines are quite beautiful. I love Francois Chidane coming from the area. Is a really fantastic producer. Jackie Blow for Taille à Loups does some really great things for both sparkling, dry and off-dry wines within the region itself as well. All right, South Africa. I hope Rachel, I saw you were drinking both South Africa and France. So I hope you're chatting in the box about maybe some of the interesting differences you're really seeing in these two styles of wine. So Chenin Blanc, we already know, is the most planted grape variety in warmer countries, even though oftentimes we see Chenin Blanc in cooler climates in South Africa. It's prized for its acidity. Chenin Blanc will retain its acidity almost anywhere it's grown, even if it's a warm climate, even if it does see higher yields and possibly more irrigation. So it really is prized for this ability to maintain its acidity, to be used for these noble sweet wines, so the wines aren't flabby on the palate. And also when we use it in blends, especially in the sort of white blends, jug wines of the old California white wine style. I don't think we really see much of that anymore, so that's why I want to say the old style, but like those Carlo Rossi wines, we would blend in some Chenin Blanc, even if it wasn't the base of the wine, or we would use it as the base of the wine to make sure that we had enough acidity in that wine. So it adds acidity to things like Chardonnay, to things like Colombard, even to Semillon, which is also great for its own acidity as well, but Chenin has even more. It was probably one of the original vines in the collection imported by Jan van Riebeck in 1655. He was a Dutch surgeon who was commissioned by the East India Trading Company, sort of one of the world's first global monopolies on trade, to go to South Africa and actually set up sort of a garden station for sailors who were suffering from scurvy as they were coming around the Cape of Good Hope. So he's 33 years old, he's a young surgeon. He probably didn't want to go to South Africa and set up this brand new colony in a place that was in a completely different hemisphere, almost as far away in the world that you can get from someplace like Holland. But he came here, and he had forever since been known as sort of the founder of Cape Town and the founder of the South African colony itself as well. For a long time, Chenin Blanc was, South Africa has a pretty troubled history. So I will probably go like 5 minutes over, guys, but not too far, not too long. South Africa has a troubled history. A lot of people know about their troubled political history with apartheid. So a lot of really big issues with racial inequality there as well. But however, today I think one of the things about South Africa is they have, in the wine community, I guess I can't extend this to all sectors within South Africa, but in the wine community, they're really doing a lot of things in South Africa to promote Black-owned brands, to promote Blacks working within vineyards, purchasing, having sharing shares within wineries and things. They really have a lot of Black education for the wine producing regions in South Africa, which I think is pretty fantastic. I should have put a little bit more of that here, but maybe I can send something with the follow-up tomorrow. But Chenin Blanc has always been the most planted for a long time. It was used for up until 1994 when apartheid ended. Between phylloxera and 1994, pretty much all of the wine coming out of South Africa, aside from a few producers who were focused on quality, were bulk wine, or Chenin Blanc was used primarily for brandy production. So they do have a long history of distilling grapes for brandy within South Africa as well. It's actually quite popular. You may remember that twice during COVID, they've actually stopped the sale of alcohol at all within South Africa. I think since the second time they've started legalize the sale of alcohol again. This is because most people don't really drink inside the home. It's a very it's a very kind of community thing to do within South Africa. So by stopping the sale of alcohol, they were actually trying to limit these social gatherings as well. So that's one of the main reasons that they do that there. But we do have in the last couple of decades sort of a really dedicated band of specialists emerging that are focusing on restoring high quality production of old vineyard blocks. Now this is not only for Chenin Blanc, but Chenin Blanc is the most planted grape. So they have about 18,000 hectares of Chenin Blanc, double what we have within France, and about 9,000 hectares of that is actually old vine Chenin Blanc. So we're thinking vines of 35 years or older, which also oftentimes increases the quality, the concentration of these grapevines as well. We do see some sweet wines coming from Chenin Blanc within South Africa, but the main sweet wines are actually coming from grapes like Muscat, coming from Constantia. So we typically see it more for the production of more dry still wines for Chenin Blanc. We don't see it as much for the production of sweet wines like we do within the Loire. The export boom has really transformed this industry and really divided these sort of quantity producing majority to the quality conscious minorities. So we're seeing a lot more of this. There's been revolutions, especially for Chenin Blanc in regions like Swartland, sort of one of the traditional heartland for Chenin Blanc. Certainly within the Paarl region, in Breda Clwyf, we really see a lot of the production of Chenin Blanc here. Breda Clwyf and Worcester and Robertson were areas that were kind of inland, so they're a little bit warmer. So we see a lot of the production of brandy coming out of this area from the grapes as well, but we see a lot of old vine material there. So some really quality focused producers. Up here in Citrusdale and Oliphant River, really high elevation. We have producers up here like Tierhoek that are doing really fantastic things with high elevation Chenin Blanc, which is really beautiful. And then also, we don't really see it so much planted in like Hermanus, but in Elgin and Bolt Riviere, we have Beaumont, Lismore, Paul Kluver, Iona, all doing really cool things with Chenin as well. I haven't seen any Chenin coming out of Hemmelin Arda, although maybe somebody else knows of some. I think that would be kind of cool, but we see primarily more, we see a little bit of Pinotage, but mostly Pinot Noir, some Syrah, and Chardonnay coming out of the area. But I also think too, you can get some fantastic old vine Chenin Blanc for really cheap in South Africa. The wines are not expensive coming from this area. Some of the wines coming from Swartland have become expensive. The Abensadi wines, the David and Nadia wines, the Three Foxes wine. These are all a little bit more, the Duncan Savage wines, they're kind of becoming a little cultish. So those wines are more expensive, becoming well known, but you can still get like Ken Forrester wines, old vine Chenin, or one of the best producers of Chenin. He's called Mr. Chenin in South Africa, coming from Stellenbosch for $20 or less a bottle. The Man wine, the Rat wines are AAT Chenin coming out of here, fantastic. I really love the wine coming from Botanica, from Ginny Povil as well, which can be really great. And I'll send some of these producers tomorrow. You can't tell that I was recently in South Africa by that, right? Last year, pre-COVID. But you can also tell that Chenin is so important here as well, that they've actually come up with their own aroma and flavor wheel for Chenin Blanc as well. And they also think it's important to differentiate between a fresher style of Chenin, and unlike the Loire Valley in France, we do sometimes see new oak being implemented for Chenin Blanc coming out of South Africa. So you can see how that can change a lot of the flavor profile of the wine itself. So aside from botrytis, which adds like your, your ginger, your marmalade, your honey with bottle age, also with these oak wines, of course, you see more of that almond, vanilla, toast characteristic that we would expect from anything aged in oak. And these wines can be really beautiful because, again, they retain that acidity. And it's really fun to see some of these stylistic differences from these different producers. All right, so I told you I'd only go 5 minutes over, so we have 2 minutes to talk about California. But California, unfortunately, today is not as important for Chenin Blanc. In 1980, they actually had more Chenin Blanc planted than France, but they've fallen to less than 9,000 hectares. I think it's around 7,000 hectares right now. Historically, there's really been few champions of the grape. Most of the Chenin Blanc that has been planted within California was planted within the Central Valley. So it's really kind of the antithesis of its homeland. And this is what I was referring to earlier when we were talking about these yields that, sort of for the most basic Chenin Blanc coming out of the Loire Valley are usually around 45 hectoliters per hectare. For Chenin Blanc coming out of California, the unfortunate thing is about California, we don't necessarily always think about differentiating the fact that most wine from California, just production-wise, comes from the Central Valley and goes into boxed wine and jug wines and your sort of basic everyday supermarket you know, slap a label of like a hot cartoon girl on it and like sell it for $6, you know? So we don't really think about that quite often, but about 90 or 85% of the wine that comes out of California actually comes from the Central Valley. So it's a really high percentage. But we do have some fantastic producers of Chenin. I think Chapelet is the most important to know coming out of California. This is the bottle I picked up when I visited their Pritchard Hill estate in 2000. This is 2017. I was there in 2018, I want to say. 2018? Anyways, 2018 or 2019 when I was in California, I visited Chapelet in Napa Valley. Definitely worth the trip if you head that way. Chapelet was Molly Chapelet's favorite wine, which is why you see her signature on the label here. At one point, they actually produced 5 different styles of Chenin Blanc coming from the vineyard themselves. And in fact, Chapelet produces a lot of, or sources a lot of their grapes from the rest of Napa Valley. Not all of the fruit for all of their bottling come from the Pritchard Hill estate, but all of the Chenin does come from Pritchard Hill because they've kept these old vine planting because Chenin Blanc was Molly's favorite. So today I think they pretty much focus on this dry style. You might also see the wine coming from Sandlands. This is the brand started by Tegan Passalacqua, who's also the producer for Turley Wine Cellars. Coonan Wine, Seth Coonan, recently passed away, unfortunately. Pac Male for Pac Wines, producing a lot of Chenin Blanc coming from Sonoma. Field recording from the Central Coast, Hardy Wallace from Dirty and Rowdy, and Matthew Rourke from Forlorn Hope. A lot of producers get wine, Chenin Blanc, from Matthew Rourke Heritage Vineyard. It's located just out of Sacramento in Alta Mesa. So some cool stuff going on there. So look for some of these producers. I would stick with sort of these producers that are choosing to use, if you're thinking about California Chenin, look for a place on the label. If it just says like California white wine, you know, unless you know the producer and you know that they're trying to be like super avant-garde, like I would just like make sure you look, you know, does it say Napa Valley? Does it say a vineyard in Sonoma, you know, that coming from somewhere like Amador? Even some places in Lodi can be really cool, even though it's considered to be a little bit further inland for some of these old vine plantings. How are we doing, guys? Sorry to keep you over. So what should we eat with Chenin Blanc, right? Well, you can think about Riesling, anything that might be like kind of salty. I really love bone marrow, this kind of like saltiness, like a demi-sec Vouvray, this sort of sweet and salty characteristic. The dry or sparkling styles are absolutely fantastic with all types of seafood. Trout is really common within the Loire Valley, just grilled simply with some fresh herbs and lemon. You might think about the sweeter styles of Chenin with maybe some apple pie, a la mode. Of course, you know, anything that you could do, any of the styles of Chenin besides really sweet styles with scallops, with clams, with oysters, these kind of dry, more mineral-driven styles. Things like Boudin Blanc, of course, also would be, I think, just really super yummy. How are we doing, guys? I didn't get a chance to go. Okay, let me check out. Oh yeah, some bratwurst, some Boudin Blanc, Caesar salad. Jeff, I love that. Absolutely. Pork ginger scallion. Absolutely think of any type of Asian food, almost just like you would Riesling. So if you have something with a little bit of spice, a little bit of an off-dry style would be really good. I didn't tell you, I don't want to keep you guys all night, but this Nowday, I brought it back from South Africa. So usually this is a wine that's mostly Chenin Blanc with some Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. It is a blend of all three, but I looked it up right before class. And of course, unbeknownst to me, this is like the only vintage where it's actually not mostly Chenin Blanc. But I think it's really beautiful for you. It's 2009, bottled under screw cap, and you still get the beautiful, vibrant acidity, but a little bit more of the tropical fruit flavors of Sauvignon Blanc. And I'm going to have this with some grilled fish tonight, so I think it'll be really delicious. Well, I always want to hear from you. I want to know what you guys are drinking. I want to know about what Chenin Blanc you're excited to try. And of course, I'll send out some follow-up notes probably tomorrow or the day after. But if you have any questions, don't ever hesitate to reach out to me. So everybody enjoy your dinner. Have a good evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.